in this chapter, what we want to look at is that after we've looked at supply and demand, what we want to try to understand is two big concepts. We want to try to understand elasticity, which is kind of synonymous with how sensitive are consumers and producers, how sensitive are they to price changes? How much will the quantity change? And then the implication that that elasticity has for taxes. That oftentimes someone in the government will impose a tax on a good that is elastic or inelastic, and this will help us kind of predict what kind of tax revenue would be generated by that product. So, what we'll see here is that there's a few different elasticities that we can, that we kind of had some exposure to here. The price elasticity of demand, the income elasticity of demand, the cross-price elasticity, and the price elasticity of supply. Now, the key thing, again, that we see here when we look at these things is that it means sensitivity. So when you see, sorry, it's just badly written there. So when you see the word elasticity, think sensitivity. So for the price elasticity of demand, we already know that changing the price leads to a change in the quantity demanded. And specifically, we know, for instance, that if the price goes up, people buy less. But what elasticity tells us is how much less do they actually buy. Specifically, that if this goes up by 1%, is this going to change by greater than 1%, less than 1%, or equal to 1%? If it's equal, then it's unit. If it's less than 1%, then it is inelastic. And if it's greater than 1%, then it's elastic. Let's just, I'm not gonna, you don't need to worry too much about the Dutch auctions here. So let's start to talk about what this means for our surpluses and our taxes. So what we already kind of know here is that in a typical graph, here where we have demand and supply, we have our consumer surplus from the price up to the demand curve. We have a producer surplus from the price down to the supply curve. And what we're going to see here is that once we start to impose a tax, let's say, for instance, it's a $1 unit tax that is legally paid out by the producer, what we see is that it doesn't matter who actually pays. It doesn't matter who legally pays. But what that does is it tells me that I need to shift my supply curve to the left by a vertical distance of $1, because that's the amount of my tax. And what we can see here is that this amount, again, is the $1. But what we can see is that buyers are now paying some price that's a little bit higher than what they used to, and that sellers, after they pay the tax to the government, are getting a little bit less than they used to. So that's where you can see kind of the tax sharing. The amount of that sharing is going to depend on what the elasticities are. Now, for me as an economist, the big thing is not whether producers pay more of the tax, consumers pay more of the tax. I don't really care. What I care about as an economist is the size of that deadweight loss, which is right here. And what that deadweight loss represents is it represents reduced efficiency. And we see that the height of that triangle is created by the fact that fewer people will buy this good that is more expensive in price. It distorts the market. That's what taxes do. They distort the market so that buyers are now paying more than they used to, consumers are receiving less than they used to, and there's just less being sold in general. So, again, to go back to a more formal discussion of consumer and producer surplus, what we're thinking about when we think of consumer surplus is we're thinking about this idea that consumers would have been willing to pay more, but they don't. So when we draw this out, P and Q, with the demand curve, all these points here represent what are called reservation prices. And what a reservation price is it's my highest willingness to pay. So imagine that the person out here is just a really big fan of whatever this product is. Okay, so, right, people buy like Pokemon cards, they buy, food items, and you can get someone who's really, really passionate about buying that food item or about buying that Pokemon card, right? And that if you were to say to them, there is no set price. You just pay the most that you're willing to pay, right? We see, as you would in like eBay with an auction system, people will pay something pretty darn close to their reservation price. But now we know that eBay does two types of things, right? You can do something where you bid on the item, you bid your reservation price, and then there are other things that are buy it now, where you pay a set price. And if that set price was set correctly, that set price may be down here. And if you had been an auction, you would have been willing to pay so much more, but instead you feel like you got a really good deal. I use this as an example. So a few years ago, I had heard that Burger King has like kids meals as well, and that somehow they had gotten Stan Lee, the comic book guy, he's dead, but they had gotten the comic book guy to make the Backstreet Boys into superhero characters, and then those superhero characters of the Backstreet Boys were put into kids meal. And I heard about the idea from someone. I was like, that is, fantastic. What a great idea. I was like, oh, I bet you I'll never find one. Went on eBay, found one still sealed in the bag for like $5. And I'm like, free shipping. And I was like, oh my God, what a fantastic deal. Bought it right away, got it. It's fantastic. Still sits on my shelf. That right there is me expressing to you I would have been willing to pay so much more, and yet the seller set that pretty low price. Now, why did the seller do it, right? I mean, obviously, if they had known, they would have wanted to charge me that high price. But also, from the seller's perspective, they also have a difference. I don't know, maybe they got the toy, they'd been sitting in a box and no one had really cared about it. Maybe the person was just trying to declutter their household. There could have been any number of reasons of why they wanted to get rid of it. But whatever, their cost was pretty low. So them getting that set price of $5 was a great deal for them. I sell some things occasionally on eBay, and right now I've been selling, and it's weird. I say it's weird because I'm already signaling to you I'm the seller, and I'm selling like cords, like like things like where you either threw out the item or you don't know why you've got this cord sitting around your house. And I'm like, geez, what I don't even think I have the item anymore. Well, there is a market out there of people who will buy those cords. And so for me, dude, I don't even have the item anymore. I don't value the item very much. And yet there are people out there who are probably thinking the same as I did when I got that Backstreet Boy thing, right? Like, oh my God, it's fantastic. I can't believe that person is selling that thing so cheaply. And there you go. Again, this space right here would be my consumer surplus. This space right here would be my producer surplus. And again, you can see these differences. This one's just talking about differences of people paying for some textbook with their willingness to pay. Sergio, Celine, and Raquel, and their willingness to pay for some textbook. Not sure why they're showing that scene. I don't even know what movie that's from. I'm sure I should, and some of you are probably saying, God, Shedding, how can you not know what that's from? But I don't. I really can't tell. I'm not going to investigate anymore. Anyway, 3 people, 3 different willingnesses to pay. If the textbook is priced at $140, we know that Sergio and Celine would be willing to buy that book because both would feel like they're getting a better deal. They would have been willing to pay more than they otherwise would have. Raquel will not buy the book unless she's forced to, because she doesn't value the book as highly as $140. And again, these individuals would face varying levels of consumer surplus individually. We can add up that consumer surplus to get the space, the area of the entire triangle. And you could do it as kind of a stepwise function, but again, I think it's a little bit easier to smooth things out and just have a triangle. Okay. And again, we can see this on the other side of the perspective, from the perspective of the producer. In this case, you're going into the tutoring business and their willingness to sell their product. And so here we would have, basically a wage being set, and that other individuals would be willing to sell the good, to be able to, for instance, sell their labor services, as long as the wage or whatnot was greater than the wage that was set, their willingness to sell their product. Or in this case here, these students, Monica and Agata, these students would be willing to tutor at the market price of $25 an hour because their willingness to sell is less than that. So they are essentially getting $25 an hour when they would have been willing to sell their labor for 20 or for 10. Arturo, though, thinks of himself as a high-priced tutor, and so he's willing to say, why would I want to do this at this really low wage? In some sense, what we're saying here is that there's no such thing as a wage that's too low. If there's someone willing to work it, in some sense, the market should sort it out and allow that person to do that thing. And again, each of these individual producers would have their various producer surpluses, which we could aggregate, and you would see it on the side here. Okay, so what we grabbed from all that is that basically the market is at its most efficient when it's able to charge the market equilibrium price. The total surplus is maximized, which again is just our standard picture here. which looks like this. And as we see in the next chapter, anytime you try to alter the price to be something different, you reduce and you reallocate consumer surplus. But as we'll see in this chapter here, when we impose taxes, same thing. We're going to adjust how the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is allocated. And that what will change here is how the taxes have an impact on things. Okay, so there's our beautiful picture of our consumer and producer surplus. And then we can see here that as we start to change things, as we start to alter the market, the consumer surplus to any individual changes. And that as we impose taxes, with taxes being one of those things, that as we impose the taxes, that this creates problems for our consumer and producer surplus. And as well creates our deadweight loss. Okay, so economists focus on two things when they think about taxes. They think about the legal incidence of the tax and the economic incidence of the tax. So in terms of the legal incidence, as the term implies, what I'm looking at here is who's legally responsible for paying it. It's typically a all or nothing kind of deal, right? It's typically all on the buyer or all on the seller. This will determine what the legal incidence determines for us. It's going to determine which curve we shift. Do we shift the supply curve or the demand curve? Supply curve if it's a tax that's legally imposed on the seller. Demand curve if it's a tax legally imposed on the buyer. Okay. That's not too interesting, really. Here, this would be a tax that must be imposed on the buyer. So the buyer would be legally responsible for remitting the tax. The tax would have the effect of shifting down, decreasing the demand curve, causing the price to go from $4 to our new equilibrium of $3.50. But then remember, the buyer has to pay $1 to the government. Which brings it up to $4.50. So the buyer at the end of the day ends up paying $4.50. The sellers receive $3.50, and the government gets $1. That's no different than if the tax were legally imposed on the seller. A tax legally imposed on the seller now decreases the supply curve, thus shifting it to the left. Meaning that buyers pay, right, the old price used to be $4. Now with the tax, the buyer pays $4.50 because that's our new equilibrium point. And the seller has to pay that $1 to the government, so they ultimately get $3.50. It's $1 going to the government. Same thing, right? So it doesn't really matter. What the point of this slide, slide 26 and slide 27 highlight here, is that it doesn't matter who you impose the tax on, buyer or seller. The net result for all three parties, buyer, seller, and government, is really no different. So, that's basically what I just said right here. What becomes important is the deadweight loss. That deadweight loss, if we go back to these pictures right here, would again be that space right here. And again, would be that space right here. Caused by the height of that triangle, caused by that reduction in the quantity. And that's our loss of efficiency. So we see that more beautifully drawn right here. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to impose the tax on a good that is inelastic. Because the more inelastic the good, the smaller the deadweight loss. So I'm sure that the next slide has a picture where it's drawn already beautifully, but I think you deserve to see it drawn live in action. Okay. So here's a normal demand curve, supply curve. Consumer surplus, producer surplus. And then let's impose the tax. Let's say that it's on the seller. And look at that. Creates that really big deadweight loss. Okay, bad news, right? Now, let's take this same picture. And draw a really steep demand curve, meaning a really inelastic demand curve. Okay, now close the tax. Look at this. The deadweight loss is a lot smaller. Why? Because the demand for the good is inelastic. So the consumer is going to buy a lot less here because this curve is pretty elastic. For the inelastic curve, they're not going to change how much they buy that much because the nature of the good is that it is inelastic. And we can see this more beautifully drawn right here with a completely inelastic, perfectly inelastic demand curve. And so what you can see here, at least in this more beautifully drawn picture, is that part of the consumer surplus here is reallocated to the government in the form of tax revenue. Here, the consumer is paying 100% of the tax. All of the tax revenue is coming from them. So perfectly inelastic, what would that kind of be? That'd be kind of like, I don't know, insulin. Again, if you're diabetic, would be a pretty perfectly inelastic good. And so if we were to tax that kind of good, you'd be basically taxing diabetics because they're going to have to still pay for it regardless. As opposed to taxing something that has some elasticity, meaning it's not perfectly elastic, what you can see here is that in terms of the economic incidence, it's shared by both buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers are going to share that tax. Buyers are going to pay a little more than they used to. Sellers are going to receive a little less than they used to. And so they're going to share. See, you can kind of see that with that dashed line here in the green portion. They're going to share that tax burden with each other. Now we still have a deadweight loss. So it's still not good from an efficiency perspective. But we're also, the economic incidence is shared. Even though the seller is paying, even though the seller in this case has 100% of the legal incidence, there is shared economic incidence. And it's shared economic incidence because it is neither perfectly elastic or inelastic. And so we can look at it from another perspective. What if the good instead is perfectly elastic? That would be like, a particular brand of produce or whatnot. Like, do you really care that it came from a particular farm? Most people wouldn't. And so when you tax there, even though this is, again, 100% legal incidence on the seller, it's also 100% economic incidence on the seller. Because of the perfect elasticity. And so then we can make some, kind of comparison between the three. That comparison being, that there's a larger deadweight loss as the good becomes more elastic. And we can certainly see that here, that the deadweight loss is pretty big. But that also, in terms of the sharing of the tax, that the producer will pay more of the tax to the greater extent that the demand is elastic. And as the good becomes more inelastic, then the consumer will bear a larger portion of the tax. So this is useful for us because it helps us kind of understand then a little bit more about why, why certain goods are taxed or not by the government, and why they choose the particular things that they decide to tax. So then the next question would be is, we kind of looked at this from the perspective of the demand either being more elastic or inelastic. What happens if we start to change the supply curve's elasticity as well? So when we compare, again, the two elasticities, the demand and the supply, and we try to look at what happens as we bring the two together, what we would see here, in this kind of example here, we've got a supply curve which is a bit more inelastic than a supply curve. So we can see that of this $5 tax, about 60% of it, or $3, is being covered by the seller, and that the remaining portion, about 40%, or $2, is being paid for by the buyer. So this would be the example when supply is more inelastic than demand. And we would see that it's essentially the balance that we're trying to strike here is a balance between what kind of revenue is the government going to be able to bring in versus the size of the deadweight loss. Obviously the government needs to pay its bills, so you do need some tax revenue coming in. But in terms of the deadweight loss, economists are going to be most concerned about the size of the deadweight loss and trying to minimize how much, how much efficiency loss there's going to be. Okay, so obviously, under no taxes, you're not going to see any. You're not going to see any deadweight loss, and then again, once you start to impose some level of a tax, in this case, the legal incidence being on the seller, then what it does is it creates a deadweight loss. These are about equally elastic, so we would see about equal sharing of the tax revenue. But the tax revenue is pretty significant. Now, here we've got a pretty significant tax being imposed, right? Hence, the supply curve shifted by a lot, which means you'd get a lot of tax revenue, at least as a total rectangle coming in. But it also means then you've got a pretty significant deadweight loss. Do you really want that, right? So this would be like having a 50% tax on some sort of good. That would be pretty significant. And obviously you can impose a huge tax, let's say, shift the supply curve even more. Now look what happens though. There's a huge deadweight loss, but there's not a lot of tax revenue. The tax revenue is actually pretty small, right? It's a pretty, at least it doesn't have a lot of width to this rectangle. So the amount of tax revenue brought in is pretty small. And then obviously you can impose an extreme tax where you basically wipe out the entire market. And you basically, by wiping out the entire market, it's all deadweight loss with no tax revenue because no one is buying the good. The only other kind of thing you can have here is that you can have some unusual taxes. These are kind of interesting, but I'm not sure. And the author decided to make a slide about it, and it's talked about in a textbook. But for most of you in this class, I would suspect you just want to know, what do I need to know? And that what do I need to know kind of thing is that by imposing taxes, yes, the government is able to pay its bills, but imposing a tax also has economic effects. And those economic effects are understood by reduced economic efficiency. And that reduced economic efficiency can be measured by the size of the deadweight loss. Okay.